and Pinocchio. We're here to talk about games. It's been very difficult for me to begin sharing this part of my story. I realized in therapy a couple of weeks ago that's partly due to residual brainwashing I still need to work through. Things about how I'm not allowed to speak my truth if it results in any kind of negativity to my family or my old church. I will not continue to be silent and alone in my journey. I know that what happened to me was wrong, and I will speak out to validate others and to hopefully do my part to create a world that will foster future generations in a better way. I'll be using captures from my gameplay of a beautiful game called Gree while I tell my story. It's much more beautiful and interesting to look at than my face attempting to remain composed while being emotional. Gree follows the story of a person who loses their voice and all color from the world. One by one, you have to retrieve the colors of the world and journey to find your voice again. It's a gorgeous game with amazing music and visuals and dynamic but accessible mechanics. I'll do a review on it sometime when I make more progress. That's not what this video is, but I hoped it would lend a backdrop of calm and peace to an otherwise very vulnerable video. About a year ago, after the death of my mother, I began to call myself Hannah. The name I was given at birth is inspired by a Bible story, what would later turn out to be one of my very least favorite stories, in fact. This particular tale involves a man of the Lord being called to take their offspring to a special mountain and sacrifice them to God, as if they were an animal. The story is often used to discuss the virtues of faith and obedience, and sometimes the omniscience of God, things like that. But to me, the first time and every time after that I read it, all I could think of was the contradictions. How could someone put rules in place and say they were the most important tenets above all else, and then turn around and ask you to break one of them, saying it's okay this time because it's me that's asking? It never sat right with me. I started to think about what it meant that I was named after this story. I knew my parents always told me that the name meant something about God being my teacher, but it always felt like it meant I was their sacrifice child. Like they'd earmarked me for the Lord. If he ever came asking, they had me ready to go. It became something I hated to say. I never liked to tell people my name, or explain why it was spelled strangely, or what it meant. I started to use fake names for carry-out orders a couple of years ago, and it always felt like a relief. Not to be playing a character, but to not be forced to confront the character my parents so clearly wished I would play. I started to go by Hannah to friends and family. It felt right automatically. It felt normal and made me sit better inside my body, inside my own brain. I didn't feel quite so at odds with myself. I asked my workmates to make the change and was accepted and respected by everyone right away. I had been shaving my head and I liked to look at myself in the mirror now. I liked to sign my name, meet new people. Such a small couple of things had made me feel more like a person, less like an outsider to even myself. I realized this must be how most kids start to feel as they grow up and discover things about themselves. This is why children try different things out, different haircuts and clothing choices and styles. I had missed out on a lot of key parts of self-expression. When I was young, I wanted black hair. I remember always thinking that it looked very striking and mysterious. It's weird how it works growing up the way I did. If you were to ask my father if I was ever told not to dye my hair black, he would probably say no. But the way it worked was that I was fed messaging about vanity from the second I was born. So you didn't really feel like it was okay to dye your hair at all. And then there was messaging about how goth kids and emos were losers and satanic. And I remember being told there were appropriate hair colors. Like if you did need to dye your hair, you had to use a hair color. Pinks and blues were definite no's. But I couldn't understand why black was lumped in with them, as if my own sister didn't basically have black hair herself. My clothes were hand-me-downs from her, and for her they came from Salvation Army or Goodwill, hand-me-downs from some faceless stranger. There was no decision-making in fashion, no sense of style. If we did get our own things, they never seemed to fit right, always making do with what was there instead of finding what would work well. This feeling of ill-fitting surrounded me growing up. I was too curious at church, they didn't like me there. I was too serious for my sisters, they didn't like me much either. My parents liked to talk about me, liked to brag about the smart writer in the family, but they didn't like to talk to me. They would make fun of me for being quiet or shy, not realizing it was because they continually spoke over me and made me feel small. We were homeschooled for the entire duration of our education. The only exception would be my little sister, who was able to go to an art class at a local high school. I'll admit I've always been jealous of that. My mother had a stroke when I was young, and around that time we switched from more of a free-form structure to using ABECA curriculum, based out of Pensacola Christian College. While technically the program is supposedly legitimate, there are huge gaps in my education. There was a large focus on Christian themes in all of the subjects represented, even things like literature and science. I would read that math is the language of God in one book, and science is the language of God in another. The basics of everything were covered, but there were things that were glossed over, such as historical events that didn't have a lot to do with religion, while other things were given an inordinate amount of discussion. The Great Awakenings, circuit riders, how the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, things like that. For a long time, I didn't talk much about my experiences growing up, feeling some sort of sense of duty to protect my parents, even the church, still after all these years. I know all the things that they will say about me. I know what it means to be labeled an apostate. I know what the consequences can be for being honest. But it is my story. This is the way I grew up and the consequences from it. I've let other people control my narrative for long enough of my life. And if I can help someone else be a tiny bit free of that pain themselves, I'll do the work to do that. These are the things that have shaped me into the person who I choose to be. No one else can make those choices for me anymore, including the choice to tell my story. Recently, I complained to my father that I missed out on several basic scholarships that were freely available to kids growing up in our area, if he had only allowed me to go to school or at the very least take the standardized tests. He protested that I did take the ACT. What he seemed to forget about that part is that both times I took it, my results came back as not college ready in both science and math. Maybe it's because I got such a high overall score due to the other sections that he decided that didn't matter. Maybe he thinks I don't remember the discussions that were openly had in our home around the time that the MEEP was supposed to be taken by us kids. I do. I remember that Mom was nervous about if we didn't do well, what would happen. she didn't know if the state would step in and make us go to school after all. It was decided we wouldn't take the test. I only found out years later that if I had taken them, I would have been eligible for several scholarships at any school in Michigan. The thing about homeschooling is I do actually think you can do it well. If you make sure to use legitimate curriculum that actually covers things in an unbiased way, if you make sure to socialize your kids, if you make sure they can actually learn well that way in the first place, if you enroll them in hybrid classes and sports and music, if you make sure they still see a little bit of the world. In my college geography class, I had a project where I was supposed to use Google Earth to map out everywhere I would have spent time as a kid. The tiny bubble I was living in truly revealed, staring me right in the face. Church, home, library, church girls' camp, writing club at the library, grandma's house. That was it? The whole thing? I couldn't think of anything else. Oh wait, yearly field trips to the same damn museum. Yearly trips to the same damn lake. That's it. I wanted to do Girl Scouts, but I was told they'd hand out condoms and were a bad organization. I wanted to do 4-H, but I was told we couldn't trust them because they weren't Mormon. Church, home, library, grandma's house. Church, home, library, grandma's house. There's another layer to this. Money. There was a theme growing up that we didn't have money for things. I got into a writing correspondence school that was very cheap and was told I'd have to pay for it myself somehow. I was already spending all of my allowance to get myself things like clothing, shoes, driver's training, and now feminine hygiene products. Not to mention 10% of everything I earned from doing extra chores or whatever else had to go to the church. 10% wasn't really it either. The requirement to be a member in good standing is 10%. Sources differ on net versus gross. But there are all these other little boxes on the offering sheet, so you feel obligated, even as a child, to add to those also. I wanted to take dance lessons. Was told the same thing, that I'd have to pay for it myself. So instead of getting a regular education with a gym class and all the stimulation that comes from going to school and learning to exist around others, instead of learning to use my body and mind in an interactive and dynamic way, instead of existing as part of humanity, I had a stifled education at a dining room table with no stimulation except from parents and church members and my cats. Only learning to use my body and mind in static ways, existing only as a part of the Mormon Church, not humanity. When you grow up this way, you don't learn appropriate coping skills. Essentially, your emotional intelligence is stagnated at a very early age. You aren't confronted by people trying to steal your crayons or calling you names or throwing tantrums because you did something better than they did. You aren't complimented by people, hugged, asked questions, or made to laugh either. You might take a long time to develop your own personality. You might adopt the personalities of others around you to deal with anxiety and confrontation instead. You may exist largely in your own brain, which can cause cyclical thinking and rumination to a damaging degree. I struggle with something called misophonia, which is basically a systemic response to dissonant or disrupting sounds. What that means can vary depending on my comfort level, but essentially when there's a repetitive sound or an unnecessary noise, my brain struggles to concentrate on other things, and my body becomes very anxious. I think that's partially due to having grown up with such little stimulation. Now, when I'm confronted with it, my brain needs some way to categorize and make sense of the observations. But if someone is just tapping a pencil or chewing on their glasses, there's no reason for them to be doing that, and it drives me a little crazy. I never got used to it. Other people being around. This and several other things make me believe I could exist somewhere on the autism spectrum. I'll probably never know, as it's notoriously difficult to achieve a diagnosis as an adult, and especially as a female. It would have been much easier to get some help in this regard if anyone had been paying attention when I was young, before I learned so many masking techniques and ways of getting by. I remember being made fun of, always told I was unique, with a bit of a sneer from family members. It was kind of a family joke that I was weird and didn't fit in, but no one thought to get me help. It's difficult to not be angry, resentful. I've spent years in therapy trying to find ways to reconnect with my parents and feel like a family for the first time in my life. I want it so badly. I want to save my father and grandparents from the grips of the cult that stole my childhood from me. I took psychology and philosophy classes in college to try to find ways to speak to religious zealots in a calm manner that could help them see things in a new way. But there's still so much pain here for me. There's a me who could have grown up with an education. Someone who maybe doesn't have panic attacks when they think about how video games work or go into a crowded store. Someone who knows how to function well inside of their own body. Someone who has the confidence to speak up and ask questions without fear ingrained in them. Someone who had the opportunities to make more of their life. I'm angry because that person doesn't get to exist. They can never be. All I can hope to do is make the most of what I do have, which I will always know is less than I could have started out with. I've been perpetually behind in emotional development, in relationship dynamics, in educational studies, in the workforce, in society, in my own body. Alright, I gotta switch gears. This is already too long of a video. I've gotten pretty deep. I'll go into it more later. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm still figuring out how to tell it. I've been hiding pieces of it even from myself for so long. If you're a person who was homeschooled or indoctrinated or otherwise kept cloistered away from the world, how did it affect you? How are you healing yourself? Do you want to be friends? I'll close with some of the things I'm hoping to work on by using video games as therapy. Some of the childhood nonsense I'm trying to make right on my own as an adult. I'll turn up the Gree clips so you can listen while you read. I'll see you in the next video. I'm making one about building my collection, and another review coming next week.